It's been a long journey for me to get to this stage. And just thank you very much for it can feel very hard at times as well, and a lot of pressure. And so any kind of affirmation or recognition, you don't know how much it means to me and how it keeps me kind of going as well. So I would just like to take the opportunity to say a huge thank you for having me here, and just to acknowledge how much that means, and probably something that we can all take into our own kind of work and things. You can now hear my attention-seeking cat in the background, so I'll just literally close the door on him. But so first of all, thank you, and also the power of also letting people know as well. I think is something that I think we can all carry forward. In all, if you see someone doing something nice or fun or good, then it's always good to verbalize that and let them know, because you don't know kind of what they're going through at the time. I'll probably start at the beginning, which for me was when I just turned 18 years old. I'm 28 now, so this is literally about a decade ago now. I was living in a really small town in the west coast of Scotland. I kind of was very inexperienced, quite sheltered. I wasn't kind of sneaking into pubs before I was 18 or anything like that. And basically, it was one of the first ever times I'd been out, if you like, in a kind of local. I wouldn't call it a nightclub because it was incredibly tiny and kind of a sticky floor situation. And I was out for a friend's birthday party, and essentially, and full trigger warning and everything. I'm more than okay talking about this, because I've made a habit of talking about it now, and I'm being quite proud to talk about it in a way. But I remember that there was a period of the night when my friends were all out in the smoking area and I didn't smoke. So the bouncer was like, if you're not smoking out here, you're just kind of blethering or yabbering on, then go back inside and wait for your friends. So I did. So I left them, and I was just kind of in this nightclub early on in the night, and someone just offered to buy me a drink. And I kind of didn't really think anything of it. The bar was really crowded and busy, so he kind of went away into the crowd and then came back with the drink. I drank the drink, and then woke up the next morning essentially in hysterical laughter. All my friends surrounding the bed, like looking at me as if I was kind of dead. And I just remember waking up laughing, and it was a really kind of strange sensation, really weird feeling. And they were just explaining that I'd gone missing from the bar, and they kind of realised that my coat was still in the coat check and things. They were like, "That's really odd. Maybe he's just kind of, I don't know, started to walk back home." So they'd headed out to look for me on their way back home. And they were kind of, I think a wee bit merry and drunk by that point, and they were kind of shouting my name and things. And they just by chance happened to be walking past the kind of Tesco, the local Tesco car park. And there was kind of a group of people who were in the process of phoning an ambulance, who basically found me unconscious in a parking space. Kind of having been sick and things like that. And they walked me home, and then were kind of, apparently I was being sick all the way through the night. I have no memory of this at all. But we're just kind of relieved that they'd found me. They stopped the people from phoning the ambulance, which I think, looking back on now, some part of me wishes that they had, because maybe they would have done the toxicology report. It maybe would have expedited my journey or taken it out of my hands, in terms of starting to come to terms with what had happened with me. And I kind of thought nothing more of it. And in the morning, one of my close friends, once kind of people had filed off, said to me, "Finlay, I don't really know how to tell you this, but like when you go for a shower and just kind of check yourself out a wee bit." I was like, "Why? What do you mean?" He was like, "Well, but when we found you, all your buttons were undone on your jeans." And he was like, "I don't know what it might be, nothing, but I just something doesn't feel quite right." And for the next kind of good few months, I just kind of spent a lot of time thinking about it, or trying not to think about it. I knew in my heart that something had happened, but I couldn't quite verbalize or want to really understand it. But I knew that something wasn't right, but I couldn't remember. So that was part of the issue. And then I kind of tried to invent a lot of stories in my head, thinking, maybe I'd been spiked, but I'd had a bad reaction, and that's why I was really ill, and maybe that scared him off, and that's when I was found. I was coming up with all these different stories to tell myself what had happened. But fast forward kind of a few kind of difficult months where I was kind of had this internal battle going on, and this person walked onto the train I was getting home from Glasgow. I instantly recognised him, and I think even before what happened next happened, the feeling in my gut, that confirmation, and I just froze. And then I knew really in my heart, okay, something, my body would not react this way if something hadn't happened. It was like an out of body experience. I just couldn't move. And he kind of got on the train, saw me, and sat on across the aisle from me, and had one of these big, huge phones. And I remember he was like typing up on the notes app like this big long message, and then like trying to show me on the message. And he'd basically written and explained exactly what had happened that night, and he was basically telling me what had happened. It was really, I'll never understand the intentions of that person. And from that moment on, that kind of acknowledgement of what had happened, my whole world just kind of crashed. Had huge issues with managing my own mental health, also being kind of a young gay person that wasn't out, questions about, should I phone the police, questions about sexual health. It's all the kind of things that you don't really think about in the initial. It's not necessarily the kind of that your body is bruised or hurting or anything like that, but there's like lots of barriers that you then face that are actually worse than sometimes what actually happened. In that, for example, for the next few years, when I eventually moved out and went to university, I was convinced that I had HIV. Just convinced, completely paranoid about it, but couldn't go to the doctors to get because my worry was so high, which is so ridiculous. But this is where you start to encounter barriers to services that actually can be more hurtful to the person involved than what's actually happened. So I over the period of months and years, I did start to remember things in a really weird phenomenon that I believe is like a flashback, literally like how you see in the movie, where I would usually have a really bad night's sleep, very vivid dreams, and then I'd wake up and I'd remember slightly more thing, but like kind of like very like almost like the lights just turned on and then the lights turned off and there's a gap and then there's the next thing. It's really, really surreal if you've never experienced it before, that kind of memory loss. So I got kind of snippets of the night, things like remember just kind of being really out of it and laughing and smiling and finding everything very weird and kind of surreal. And I remember him pulling me by the arm out of the nightclub and different bits and pieces like that. The next few years were quite hard because I was still not really able to talk about it or anything without physically shaking or, it then having massive effect on me for the next few days. If I saw things on TV or kind of people making jokes about rape or things like that, it would trigger me and I would be really upset by it and, find myself just crying randomly inappropriately. And it was quite hard for me to understand that your control over your own body and your own emotions and things just kind of gets taken away from you a wee bit. So that was awful hard for me to understand as well. How do I just get a good night's sleep was a question I was always asking. How can I not be in a room where people are making these jokes that are, okay, maybe slightly offensive, but how can I be in a room with it and not have this crazy reaction that's not appropriate? How can I, start to explore my sexuality and form relationships and allow people to get close to me or touch me in a way that I don't kind of freak out or start shaking or all these other kind of side effects. I eventually kind of flipped at one point and got so fed up with the way I was feeling that I reached out to a rape crisis charity. I wrote them an email because that's kind of as much as I could bring myself to do. And I remember being really kind of, oh my God, I'm just sending it. It was a bit of a cry for help. I was living in London at the time, I'll add. And the reply came that they couldn't basically deal with male survivors. And they were like really, really sorry about it, but they didn't have any services. And they also, crucially, didn't signpost me to anyone that could help. So that pushed me back like another 6 months, to be honest. Because I was like, right, okay, bury my head back under the sand. Don't, that rejection was really, really hard for me to deal with. I eventually met a girl who had been through a similar situation. And that was I get a bit emotional thinking about it now, a huge milestone for me to just know someone else who understood. And we were friends for a long, long time, but we never ever talked about it ever again. But just knowing somebody who'd had a similar experience, that we didn't need to talk about it, but just someone else knows what I'm talking about and the way that I'm feeling, was mind blowing. And that kind of unlocked something in me where I thought, if I'm feeling like that, then other people must be feeling like that as well. And if there's the power of visibility and the power of knowing just that there are other people, you're not the only person on the entire planet that's happening, or it's dealing with night terrors or kind of problems as a result of what happened, would really help people. So my friend was starting up a charity called Stay Brave, which was for mill survivors, to try and address the fact that there was such little service provision. And I helped him with fundraising, and they did like this thing called Walking Brave, which raised £5,000 or something. We walked across London. And as part of that, we did an interview together, me and Alex, for Chris Godfrey, I think, who was writing for The Telegraph or The Guardian at the time. And I waived my right to anonymity. My family didn't know any of this had happened, but part of me was kind of hoping that they would, if they did find the article, then that would enable them to have start the conversation with me in a really weird, backwards, cruel kind of way. I was worried about, my mum and my dad, what they would think, and what they would, the guilt that they would have for no reason, for not being able to be there to support me in those years. And as time got on and on and on, it got even harder and harder to have that conversation. They didn't see the news article. And so kind of time ticked on, and I just kind of made it my mission, because I had a lot of guilt about not going to the police and knowing that this person still existed. And I worried about it happening to somebody else, and I kind of carried that with me for a long time as well. And so I made it my mission to try and talk about it, my experience, as much as possible, in case someone else might not be able to talk to me back about it, but be thinking, oh, that's someone that I know that's had that experience. And that kind of mission grew and grew to the point that I talked about it more and more, and another opportunity came up with BBC Scotland that was launching their new news programme called The Nine. And this young journalist reached out to me and said, would you be interested in working on a programme? I've also got some older male survivors involved, but none of them want to waive their anonymity. Would you be willing to do this? And I kind of just said yes. And we worked on a programme that then, and then a sit-down kind of piece on the first ever programme of The Nine, that went absolutely crazy. I will say that every time that I did a little bit of kind of campaign work telling my story, the response was always being inundated with messages from people, sometimes men in their 80s that had never told anybody before in their life, some people that had like made anonymous accounts just to be able to send me a message, to retain their anonymity, and just say that it helped them in the same way that I was helped by finding out other survivors. And that kind of fueled me on. The BBC piece went crazy, and it was like their top trending worldwide news story, so on the written news section for months, because it kind of lifted the lid, I think, on a problem that has existed and male survivors are nothing new. There's an awful lot of us, and it's just they've never really been given a voice, or they've only ever seen a blurred face with a lowered voice on the news maybe once in a while. But it's hard to connect to these people and understand them as actual people of different experience. And so I'm really proud of the work that happened, because I think people could also not only see me as just someone normal that's telling a story, and it could happen to anybody, which it could, but also the fact that I survived it and that things did get better slowly, very, very slowly. And I still struggle with some things, but talking about it actually helped me. It was the therapy that I wasn't able to be given by support services. Essentially, I kind of did my own talking therapy, and trying to turn something very negative into a positive helped me have that kind of forward ambition to keep going forwards. There was another time I tried to access services as well, actually, and they wrote back to me and basically put me in touch with this counselling service that was, I think, in Brighton, so a couple hours or further than Brighton. And they had, I think, a 12-month waiting list, and I would have had to pay for the counselling sessions as well, so that never went anywhere. The BBC piece took off. I think it was really well understood in the LGBT community, because male violence against women also happens against men, And so I guess kind of acutely in an intersectional area where you have, gay, bisexual, trans men, if they are in a relationship with another man, then obviously the chances of some kind of abuse or domestic abuse compounds because there's actually two men involved in the relationship. And I just kind of kept going. The Attitude then magazine then featured it as a story, which again kind of brought everything up into the public light. The Robert Sinaga case happened, so the BBC had me back on to kind of discuss, to be able to have another male survivors on the take on what these men might be feeling or thinking as they go through that amazing bravery of going to court and achieving a conviction, which is just insanity. And so the narrative has started to change. I truly believe over the last few years, we've seen Coronation Street have soaps featuring male victims. All of this helps hugely because it normalizes it. And I think men often perceive themselves as being invulnerable because they are men, and especially, straight cis men. Nothing can touch them. And if it does, or you're a victim, then it's emasculine. So actually you're something other. That's not me. That's not men like me. I remember my mum, when eventually we did start to have those difficult conversations, obviously when the BBC piece took off, saying to me, I know that you survived this as a gay man, but I just keep thinking what would have happened if that had happened to your dad, and how he would have coped to it as kind of, a macho man. How would he have survived it? So a lot of the conversations I started having turned to the fact that we acknowledge a lot of the statistics about male suicide, male mental health rates, but we never ever ask the question why. And we pay homage to it kind of every International Men's Day. 1 in 3 this, or as you're talking about Black mental health and all these hugely important issues, male attainment gap in schools, men being more victims of violent crime than women. But we never ask why, or why male violence against women is so high as well. So it started to get me really interested in the prevention and the treatment to the cure, rather than just discussing the fact. And I was aware of the work that MABC was doing down south. I became very interested in the fact that we have a VOG strategy that includes men and boys, which again, even in its own title, emasculates you. It invalidates your experience. It means that a lot of the brilliant brains that have gone into the work behind VOG, but it was for women and girls, and that's why it's been a really effective strategy for women and girls. So we have better, not great, but more of an understanding about the kind of dangers of being out at night, or of what to do to access support, police, all these different kind of things. Because that VOG strategy has existed, it hasn't paid the same attention to men. We see that through lack of support services, through people telling me that they went to the police and they were laughed out of the station because they were a man. The lack of kind of counsellors who understand the male experience as well, and that maybe male victims need slightly different tiered support, and various other things. I worked with Rape Crisis Scotland. Recently, they had a big revamp. Now, they are primarily a female service, but their title is Rape Crisis Scotland, so they're the first Google search. So I reached out to them and said, this is really problematic, because I've done a whole search of your whole website, and the only time you mention men is as perpetrators. So I'm not a perpetrator, I'm a victim. And if I'm just looking for support, even if you're not providing it directly in your centres, you need to signpost or show where that support. There can be no dead ends that what happened to me. You can't push anyone back 6 months. And I worked with them over a number of months. They were extremely receptive. So it just shows that change can happen in a really meaningful way quite quickly. They rebranded everything from their color palette on the website to kind of more purples and greens rather than pink and kind of more kind of feminine branding colors, if you like. They tried to gender neutralize their language when they're talking about survivors, because it doesn't need to be always addressed to she, her in the content. Again, all these little tiny micro barriers that would just put any man looking, okay, this doesn't apply to me then. They added, at my suggestion, some practical support documents for things like night terror, because I think, and this is just purely kind of me thinking, but I think men like, in the initial steps, probably not to engage with the emotional aspect of it, but want practical help. So a self-help guide on, night terrors was something that I was really looking for, because it's something that I can practically work towards and focus on. And then I think the rest comes later when you start to actually process. But men just want kind of step by numbers, in my understanding, like they just want a one, two, three. Here's three actions you can take. You can take some control. So they produced these amazing documents, and that's had an ongoing conversation and a partnership with Rape Crisis Scotland, who have also now backed fully my campaign for the establishing a parallel strategy. Now that's huge because historically women's organisations have fought really, really hard for their funding, and they don't actually have enough funding for the amount of referrals that they're receiving. And so any threat or perceived threat to their way of operations, they have to defend their own interests, and I fully understand and respect that. And I think that's why I love, even in the MABC, the kind of membership documents or, the mission, that it's stated explicitly and clearly that anything that takes anything away from women's services is absolutely unjustifiable, and that we wouldn't campaign for it. And I've said that all along as well at every single stage. If what I'm arguing for means less money for women's services, then I'm afraid I can't argue for it at all. It's about equity and not and not taking anything away. And I think part of this strategy would also help do that, because it takes, if there is any brains, which I actually don't think there are in the Vogue strategy world, concentrating on men and boys, it takes them away, and the focus is returned to being solely about women and girls in that strategy. Men are a different beast. We have kind of very different ways of thinking about things. I think in general, the issues of masculinity are unique to men or trans men, and it's very different than a female experience. The kind of cultural norms around masculinity, about strength, about vulnerability, we have a long way to go in that cultural conversation. I think it's a lot easier in some ways for female survivors, and there's a lot more of a collegiate environment of a shared experience. We saw that through Me Too, of women coming together, supporting each other, being open to listen. I don't think men in the pub, kind of on the Friday night, engage on that level. I think we've got a way to go in changing the culture around that, and that will be an amazing kind of wider cultural. We're getting there. We're starting to understand that actually being vulnerable is one of the most strong things you can do and bravest things you can do. But we don't acknowledge that often with other men. And so we reinforce these kind of boxes that don't enable us to reach out. Actually, the majority of the kind of feedback I've had from men who aren't survivors is, wow, that's so brave. Wow, wow. So the support is there, but we keep it to ourselves. We don't ever ask other men how you feel. Are you okay? Do you need support? Do you want to talk about it? We never go there. And that cultural conversation is something that I think, having this, even just having the parallel strategy, which is what we're working towards in Scotland now, would really hallmark at. Yes, men can be victims. Yes, men are also victims of male violence. So get on board with tackling male violence against women too, because it's not just about happening to other people. It happens to you too, whether that be knife crime or kind of, coercive control or image-based or rape and sexual assault or childhood sexual assault. It happens to men too. So, I think it can also unify people in that very feminist mission. I guess probably useful to tell you how I got the door opened in the first place, and that's obviously primarily through me being a member of the SNP and an active campaigner and doing a lot of favours for politicians, and then just asking. I believe in the power of just asking for things and seeing where you go. The kind of my work was acknowledged in parliamentary motions initially, which just kind of said we recognise that male victims exist, which again was powerful. And then it became more about an ask. So it was like, right, okay, I get all this kind of fluffy stuff, but now what we need is some brains or civil servants working on this or whatever you can provide. So it started by basically just me hammering out emails to members of the Scottish Parliament, asking for meetings, whether they represented me as a constituent or whether they maybe had a particular policy brief or interest in it. And really it was pushing an open door. There's an understanding as well, I think, that I got that far because I'd already engaged with women's organisations and had their grace and their consent to go ahead as I would, and they knew where I stood and what I was pushing for. So there wasn't any kind of backdoor or surprise or shock from the women's sector that was happening. They already knew, they were involved in the discussion, and I think that's really important, even though they don't cater to men and boys, that they feed in and make sure that we go about this in the right way, because there's a wealth of expertise already built up. And so I kind of keep pushing, and currently I guess the status of the work is that yes, we got it in the manifesto, but obviously people can promise anything in a manifesto. So I think we have to be a bit politically astute and not necessarily as partisan. So when I was meeting with the manifesto team to talk about this policy ask, whilst they were very engaged and very supportive, I made it clear, that if it wasn't the SNP that was taking this forward, the chances are that perhaps, with the consultation ongoing at that time, the Tories down south might. And do you really want to be one step behind them? Or, Scottish Greens have a big presence up here. I'm more than certain that they would take up this issue. Do you really want an opposition party using this as a kind of stick to poke you with? So there's a little bit kind of Machiavelli element that I think you have to do in anything political. But they took notice. And so what they basically promised in their manifesto, which they were elected to the government on, was to establish a parallel strategy for tackling intimate and sexual violence against men and boys, which is great wording and was a bit of a win because it's inclusive of things like forced marriage, domestic abuse, coercive control. So it was more than just sexual violence, which is really important. I'm not really sure they're aware that they kind of caved in on that one without considering it, but and it was crucially in the wording to sit in parallel with and complement the work of Equally Safe, which is all the work that the Scottish Government's been doing, actually really, really good work for example, forensic medical bill, which means that you have the right to get forensic evidence taken with no obligation to go to the police. It's just stored in a cold room, which means that survivors can just deal with themselves and then approach court action later on. We're getting rid of, or trying to get rid of, the equally not proven verdict in Scotland, which lets an awful lot of rapists and abusers off the hook on a technicality. And other work that they've been doing around supporting, funding these services. The programme for government then came out, and they've not committed to it in this year of Parliament, which was expected because of coronavirus, because of 1,000,001 other kind of things that is really, really important. But they did still acknowledge it, which I found was really crazy because I was expecting no mention. So they mentioned, I think, supporting services financially who support male victims. So again, men are on the agenda, which is fantastic, and not just kind of being sidelined or incorporated under VOG. And that basically means that there is no attention. And so at the moment, what I've basically been doing is pushing for, because it's in the manifesto, we can get questions asked, which then tie a civil servant down to a timescale. So if another MSP, I'm working with Paul McClellan MSP, who is a really, really good MSP, very involved in male violence against women. The kind of White Ribbon Scotland organisation, all of that. So he's kind of taken it upon himself to start asking these questions of the government as a backbench MSP, which is fantastic, because hopefully then what it means is that these bodies, or these civil servants who surround Christina, who's the minister, who is very much on side, then also have to start putting the thought in, okay, we're actually being asked about a timescale, so it keeps it on the agenda. And so we're hoping within the next year or two that it'll become a reality, and hopefully put pedal to the metal for the campaign down south and in the rest of the UK. Because if we've got it up in Scotland, and I know that the pressure is mounting on the government from the Crime Commissioner and the Victims Commissioner, etc., who are saying this is nuts, it's really overdue. So hopefully if we can get it in Scotland, then that will, help further the mission down south. Interestingly, I don't think it's something to be given up on down south, and maybe I need to have this conversation with you guys soon, but I was talking to Lord Duncan, a Conservative peer, who thinks that there might be quite a lot of support in the Lords for kind of pushing this issue, which is an interesting angle of attack too. So I'm trying to think about down south as well as up here, but at the moment it's like, let's secure this in the body of work. And I've been massively helped by building a coalition of women's organisations, you guys, and the work that you've done in terms of producing kind of, policy documents in terms of what the actual ask is, which is what all MSPs want to know, is how much does it cost, and what is it you actually want us to do, and what does the strategy look like. They don't see it as much of a barrier. To be honest, Christina, the minister, said, that they've already got the bodies in the room. They already work with all these organisations. They've got the experts. They've got the policy specialists in the room already. It's not like they're starting from scratch. It's just about starting to shape the thinking of, and what about men and boys? And so in this strategy, we'll obviously be the vehicle for that. Crucially, it wasn't a financial pledge either. It's just a strategy. And now we all probably know that the strategy will find that there's not enough services. And therefore it probably will become a financial ask, but it's not an immediate financial ask, which also made it easier to move for a government that's, continually facing, unfortunately, cuts to their Scottish Parliament budget and things like that. So they have to balance out financial asks as well. And that's kind of where I'm at. I think just kind of big takeaways, lessons learned has been stories are really powerful. Leading from a place of kindness and understanding is really powerful. Asking people for help is a really powerful tool in any campaign, or advice, because then you're empowering the other person to feel involved in the campaign. So asking for, just even as an ask, just to say, here's my story. Do you have any advice? What should I do next? Is really powerful, because then you start to build key allies. Just kind of the power of a story and the power of building a coalition of people, especially identifying the people who could be opposed to this and understanding the reasons why. And the reasons are many, unfortunately, because of a lot of damage that was done in the 80s and 90s by kind of men's rights activists who went about, perhaps a just cause, but went about it in entirely the wrong fashion. And we have to be aware that there are obviously also safeguarding issues regards to opening up service provision for men. Unfortunately, men who are abusive will often abuse these services. That's what rape crisis centres have told me when they have kind of opened up phone lines to be gender neutral. That unfortunately what happens is controlling men can then use that as a way of kind of false flag, being the victim themselves to further control or abuse their partners. So there's really tricky questions. It's not impossible that these safeguards can be put in and the people will understand how to safeguard, and that's really important as well, part of the work. But we as men also have to acknowledge that the majority of the victims to this are female, women and girls, and that is the case. I believe there's a lot more men than there's reported, and it's not a small issue, but fundamentally the lion's share of any resource, etc., has to be pushed into supporting women and girls who are the victim of male violence. And that's just a fact as well, something that needs acknowledged from the offset. And it's important as well, because a lot of my words, again, every time I've told my story, have been twisted to, this is why feminism has gone too far, the government only cares about women, blah, 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 blah. And I have to refute it 100% out. No way in hell is that what I'm trying to say. Yes, male survivors are under-serviced, under-reported, under-helped, under-strategized for, but that's no reflection on or reason to get angry about the really brilliant steps and expertise that will help male victims that's already existing in the women's sector. There's a lot of amazing work that's happened in Vogue, and it just needs replicated and tweaked to be suitable for men. So I'll stop blathering there. Hopefully that was kind of useful or kind of interesting, but that's the story and the journey and what I've learned, I guess.
Finlay, that was just absolutely extraordinary, fantastic. Let me try and put us back into more. I mean, wow, I hadn't heard the story before, and so all-encompassing and impressive and profound, and what incredible work you've done, really. You've made such extraordinary strides, and so many insights there that I wouldn't want to go over them now, but I don't know whether the best way to open it up is, I haven't seen any particular questions in the chat. What we do have, here we go, we've got a message from Robin. Brilliant, very moving. Thank you, Finlay. We've got, I want to think perhaps the best way to, actually before moving on, I do think it would be wonderful if we can. I don't think we actually has had a sort of a formal conversation between, or formal, kind of a specific dedicated conversation between Finlay and NBC's board about working in a more coordinated fashion. So that would be a really fantastic thing to do. And basically, we can just drag on your coattails if you don't mind, you know, and sort of.
Not at all. It's the other way around. Yeah, I just got very lucky, I think, in Scotland, so it's totally the other way around. Don't get it mixed up.
So that's something definitely put on the agenda. But the other thing, I mean, one of the things that really comes out so loud and clear there is the crucial importance and power working in concert with women's organisations, and that's very much on the agenda for NBC as well. But something perhaps to sort of push up to the forefront a bit as well. I mean, maybe the best thing is to ask Ali to chip in, who's our lead on violence against women and girls, or intimate violence against men and boys strategy. And he did a lot of the drafting of the policy documents you mentioned there as well. So I think Ali, would you like to take it away? Any thoughts, responses?
Happy to. Yeah. Thank you. I'd first of all reiterate what Dan said. Every time I've heard you speak, Finlay, I've been moved to tears and inspired. And for me personally, as someone who was talking about this is a policy issue, not just a human tragedy, but actually a matter of politics and practical social policy for I don't know, 15, 20 years or something now. Without, I think the expression is blowing smoke up your arse, without being overly unctuous, I've never heard an advocate for male survivors and victims who is more compelling and engaging and effective as an advocate than you are, Finlay. And when I first became aware of your activities a few years ago, it kind of felt like everything moved on absolutely up a level, and we started playing this. It's not a game, but we started addressing this issue at a level we just weren't at before. So just to reiterate, thank you for everything you've done and continue to do, and it is enormously appreciated. I've got one small point I would like to add to what you said. I think a point you didn't make that I feel is quite important, but I'll come back to that in a second. Before I do, if we can do a very quick update on where the rest of the UK is on these issues in terms of policy. Because around the time that the things began to move forward in Scotland, and you squeezed this commitment out of the SNP, first thing, the Home Office was persuaded, and Mark Brooks is in the chat here. He was very involved in this. About 5 years ago, 6 years ago, Mark and Duncan Craig from Survivors Manchester in particular persuaded the Home Office to come out with a male victims position statement to sit alongside their violence against women and girls strategy, which was actually the first acknowledgement by UK government that male victims even exist to all intents and purposes. And it clarified this position that male victims of domestic violence and other intimate crimes, sexual violence and other intimate crimes, are victims of violence against women and girls, which is something that obviously we never agreed to, or no one ever asked any male survivors about at all. It was just imposed on us. So this is where the ongoing political campaign really began. One big step forward I'll tell you first is, as most of you, probably all of you know, over the last year and a bit, the Home Office was revising its violence against women and girls strategy and promising to update its male victims position statement. Now, I can tell you very little at the moment because we are sworn to confidentiality in this, but Mark and I were very recently, like in the last week or so, asked to do a reading of their initial draft of the new policy. What's in it is confidential, and it would be inappropriate for us to tell you, particularly since this is being recorded. But I will say it is more than twice as big as it was before. There's an awful lot more in it that wasn't before. There are still several issues that are not in there that we would very much like to be in there, and we are continuing to push that. But there's an awful lot of stuff that we did ask for that it looks like it will go through. So there's been a big step forward there. And what we're hoping is that a comprehensive effective, functioning, practical male victims position statement will become the basis of a parallel strategy, and it's a much smaller jump from where hopefully we will be shortly to a parallel strategy than it was before. It's not much of an ask of politicians anymore. So there's a big step forward there. But the other thing that I think is really interesting is in the various forms of devolution around the UK. Several police and crime commissioners in England and Wales are now looking at developing their own male victim support strategies. So in Greater Manchester, where obviously we were directly affected by the Reynard Sanaga case, which profoundly affected people here. It was like a massive scandal. The mayor's office, Andy Burnham's office, particularly with Baroness Beverly Hughes, who's his deputy mayor, they are currently in the process of developing a complementary strategy for male victims to go with the localised violence against women and girls strategy. And I haven't had any engagement with them, but I believe West Yorkshire are doing something very similar as well. And we hope that as the local areas with the PCC constituencies will continue to do that around the country. And literally just this morning, thanks to Mark who alerted me to, in Northern Ireland, they are currently running a consultation, a listening exercise on a proposed new parallel strategy, which is slightly different to what we are asking for. And what they are doing is two complementary strategies. The first is a gender-neutral domestic and sexual violence policy, which kind of addresses all victims of gender. And then alongside that, something quite like the Equally Safe campaign in Scotland, I think a specific anti-misogyny, anti-sexism strategy aimed at targeting the values and beliefs that underpin violence against women, literal violence against women, as opposed to the AWG crimes. Now, I'm not entirely happy with that, or I don't think it's quite perfect, because the domestic and sexual abuse strategies shouldn't be gender neutral in my view. There are, as Finlay explained so eloquently, there are issues unique to male survivors that don't apply to female survivors, and vice versa. There are a lot of the gender issues behind male victimization, but also the lack of support and social engagement with the issue and all the rest of it that are very much gendered. So I'm not entirely in favor of an entirely gender neutral DV and SV strategy. But I think what they are doing in Northern Ireland is they're trying to address the underlying contradictions and problems, and they come up with a slightly different solution, which is definitely worth talking about, and it's definitely better than with Home Offices now. So all of these things are moving on apace. And while I've got this moment, I'll take the opportunity to thank everybody involved, and a whole lot of others who are not here today, because we've all been pushing at different doors. And one thing Finlay said that I was really struck by, and it's something we've come back to at the Men and Boys Coalition, not just in this context, various other contexts. It's amazing how often you push at these doors and you find out that they're open. People are willing to talk to us. People are willing to hear the arguments. People are, so long as there's not, particularly if there's not a budget involved, are happy to help where they can, particularly the civil servants and people who work behind the scenes in politics and policy, are often very understanding of the issues. So we should never underestimate the importance of just pushing at the door, because it's something Robert Halfon said when we were talking about boys' education at one of our conferences a couple of years ago, when we asked him, Mr. Halfon, you're aware of all these problems with boys' education. Why has nothing been done before? And he said, nobody ever asked us before. I'm just going to take that phone call off the hook. Apologies. And I've got one more point I wanted to make, because it relates to what Finlay said, and I'm not an argument, but hopefully this is a complementary addition to what you said. There is one particular concern I have about where the narrative around violence against women and girls or male victims is at the moment, which is, as we have done this essential work of engaging and befriending the women's sector, particularly Rape Crisis in England and Wales have also been really supportive of our campaigns as well. And there's increasingly people across the women's sector are looking for ways to address our concerns and incorporate us into the bigger picture and support us in ways that don't affect them and the rest of it. But one thing that's slipping in is a reluctance to acknowledge the existence of female perpetrators. So we will hear about male violence against other men, we will hear about domestic violence in same-sex relationships, and we will hear about child abuse committed by men against boys. Almost never will anyone voluntarily admit that there is also a constituency within male victims. There's an easily forgotten constituency of survivors who are victimized by women in child sex abuse scenarios, by women in domestic violence scenarios. And this is just something we have to watch out for and beware of. Because again, I broadly very much agree with where you're coming from, Finlay. This is overwhelmingly a problem of male violence that we're talking about in the accusation. And we should never shy away from the fact that the majority of perpetrators in all these offences, and in some of them quite a large majority of perpetrators, are other men. That's just the fact of it. But we can't allow the male victims of female perpetrators to be forgotten in this conversation. So that's something I just want to throw in, that this is part of the equation too. And where we still have issues to resolve with the women's sector, it will be on that front, because that's where they're particularly touchy about acknowledging it. Yeah, the women's sector is absolutely fine to acknowledge that men perpetrate violent and intimate crimes against other men. They're much less willing to acknowledge that sometimes women do too, because there's ideological, criminological issues in there that they really don't want to engage with. So I'm throwing that in there, and I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to be quiet now and open up to questions from other people that we haven't got.
Yeah, that's all. I mean, that's all fantastic. I mean, I think having the two of the biggest brains on this at the forefront of this conversation in the UK speaking about it is I mean, couldn't want for more, really. I mean, are there particular questions that anybody has? We've only got 4 minutes left, so we're nearly at time anyway. There's been a few nice comments. Basically, everybody's cheering you both on, I think, is what we're learning from this conversation so far. Yeah, so I mean, I don't have anything further to add. I think it seems like we're probably everybody's just very, very pleased to be having this conversation, and I'm so thrilled that this is now our second Embassy Friday session. To have one of such quality and caliber to be sharing with people is really brilliant. I think this is going to, I mean, just your everything you were saying there, Finlay, to be able to share that beyond this this forum will be fantastic. Let me see what we've got here. Thanks and a massive respect to Finlay. Agree with Ali about reluctance to recognise female perpetrators from Tanya. Really helpful, everyone. Lots to think about. So I guess maybe, unless you have any final points to make, Finlay or Ali, should we call it a day?
Yeah, just a huge thank you for having me and for having this discussion, and lots of reasons to be hopeful and cheery after a long push, both even just the national conversation that's happening, which is powerful in its own respect, because if some point what hopefully will happen is you won't need the strategy because the culture is changed, and as if the culture changes, then actually that will do the work of the strategy for it. Because if we start acknowledging the issues and supporting one another as men, or as women supporting men, or acknowledging survivors, then there's no need to kind of feel on your own or isolated or all the rest of it. And so it's a kind of two-pronged approach. What they're both running in parallel, which is great, and I think I so agree with what you're saying, and great to hear from Ali about the updates in terms of around the UK. Feels like it's a tipping point. I remember when I talked to a leader of the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre here, and we went for coffee and a chat about everything and what I wanted to get her thoughts on it all, and she just said that it's time. She was like, it feels now that this is time that we do this. 10, 20 years ago, the culture, the world, the way that campaigners were going about things wasn't working in our favour. But now we have an opportunity as a really positive campaign, constructive, collaborative. That's how we'll get the result. And it feels like it's time, and long before time, and it's really exciting, I think. So thanks very much for having me.
Well, thank you so much, Finlay. I don't think we could end on a better note. Wonderful. Well, I will be sharing news of our next MC Friday session, Friday 25th of March. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now. Bye.
Thank you very much, everybody.